Hello, welcome to Over Minis. Now, I think basing your miniatures is an important part of the hobby. Really finishes them off nicely if you do something cool with the base. And if you make it all consistent between the minis, it makes them look like they're part of the same game or the same force or whatever you might be doing. For Heroquest, I decided to do Flagstone bases. These are all 3D printed. And they fit in with the Heroquest theme. Looks like all the heroes and monsters are wandering around a dungeon, and I've painted them in a way that looks quite similar to the corridors on the Heroquest board. So it kind of fits in with the whole theme and all that kind of stuff, and I think it looks cool. Now, I had a few questions from my mate, hi Josh. He was curious about how I did the bases in general, so I thought I'd do a few videos just showing you how I did these bases, which is really quick and really simple, and how I've done a few other bases I'll do in some other videos. I happened to print out a nice large rectangular base to use to go underneath some of the furniture. In Heroquest, the furniture pieces don't always cover all of the squares they're supposed to be blocking, so we've had some issues with the kids thinking that they can go onto the squares when they can't. So I figured if I could print out some of these larger bases, they could act like a blocker, put them on, and then it doesn't matter how the furniture is placed. You know that you can't walk on the flagstones essentially, and it gives a nice convenient way to show you how I painted the bases for all the other miniatures. So as I said, this is a very simple painting method, nice and quick. I 3D printed the bases. I'll put the STLs below where I got them from. Spray painted it Chaos Black from GW, and then a light spray of Wraithbone to get the shadows in place already. So this is kind of a slapchop type method, but not using the dry brushing to get the shadows, but using a zenithal spray. But other than that, very similar. So then it's just a case of slapping contrast paint all over it. I'm using Basilicanum Grey here because I like the dark grey effect. It gives a nice kind of stony feel to the flagstones. But you can find other shades of grey in the contrast paint range or the speed paint range or all the other various sort of paints that are out now. There's going to be a grey out there for you, I'm sure. But it's just slapping it all over, getting it into the recesses. I'm using it off a wet palette here, so a few drops of water to thin it down, just to help it flow into those recesses. And yeah, it's simple. You could almost stop there if you wanted to, because that's kind of the point of contrast paints and speed paints, is that you can do it in one foul swoop. But I decided to do a couple of extra steps, which, again, still not very difficult, but do enhance the overall finish. So this is the contrast paint finished. The only issue that I find with it is that you get some blotchiness on the flat surfaces. You can see there where it pulls a little bit, and that's not ideal, I think. It kind of doesn't look too natural. It's good how it pulls into the recesses, but on the flat bits, not so good. But really, contrast paint's designed for working with textures, so I'm not moaning about contrast paints. It's doing what it says on the tin, but the effect here looks a little bit blotchy on the flat bits, so I went in with a bit of Dawnstone dry brushing. And so this is just a case of doing some stippling and a little bit of dry brushing on top of the stones. The grey that you get from the Dawnstone is very similar to the finish you get from the Basilicanum Grey. So in some ways it's quite subtle, but I think the finish is dramatically improved by doing it. I'm using the Artis Opus palette here for dry brushing, which I think is great, and also the dampening pad. It's worth checking out Byron's videos from Artis Opus because he's the absolute master of dry brushing. And there's certainly an argument to be made that this could all be achieved with dry brushing. Of course it could. Just start from black and dry brush up. That would be very easy to do on this large rectangular base. Slightly more difficult on the bases of the miniatures because when I'm assembling them, I tend to pin them onto the base before spraying and painting them. I do that for a couple of reasons. It means that if I haven't got them painted yet, I can still play the game with them. I don't have to wait around. But also means I've got something to hold on to when I'm painting the miniature. It's just how I normally do it. Not always, but normally. And in those cases, it can be difficult to get your dry brush in between their feet without then painting the feet grey. So that's not ideal. So that's part of the reason why I use the contrast paint to start with, because then between the feet I don't really need to worry about getting my brush in there, because the contrast paint's done it. And it's easier to get the contrast paint in there between the feet than it is to get a dry brush in, I find. On this big base I'm using a big fat dry brush. I think this is one of the Army Painter ones, but obviously on the smaller bases I'll use a smaller dry brush. Use whatever one is appropriate for the base that you're painting. So with the dry brushing done, it's just softened the flagstones a bit, got rid of some of those little pools on the flat surfaces, but you've still got a nice bit of texture. I've introduced a bit of texture sometimes with a little bit of stippling, which is one of the techniques that Byron uses a lot in his dry brushing, and I think it looks pretty cool as it is. But I did a little bit more to it to make it look even better, and used the Talent in a Bottle, that strong tone from Army Painter. They've got the soft tone, which is a light brown, the strong tone, which is a darker brown, and dark tone, which is just off black. And I use these quite a lot because I think they introduce a lot of good depth and just really tie models together quite nicely. Not strictly necessary on this particular base, but I do like the warmth that it brings to it. Makes it look a little bit more natural, having that slight sort of brown colour in there. I mean, it doesn't make it all look brown. Weirdly, it just kind of softens it a bit more, makes it look natural, I think. But the main reason for using it is because I use this Quickshade on the entire model, and when they're stuck on the base it's a bit difficult to just wash the model and not the base, so I just wash the whole thing including the base. So I'm doing it here so you can see what it looks like. I think it does improve things, but again, this is a stage you could skip if you wished, and just go on straight onto the next stage of dry brushing. I thin the shade down with about equal quantities water, so it's really quite runny. Takes quite a long time to dry when it's like that. You can keep an eye on it because sometimes it will pool and you might want to start moving it around a bit or drying bits where it's a bit too wet, but really I find it tends to just be fine. Slap it all on, let it dry, takes a while, and when it's done it looks pretty good. So this is it after it's been washed, and I just do a final dry brush to highlight it a little bit more. I used grey cere for this. I found it was the right sort of tone of grey that I wanted on these bases. It's interesting because grey cere is kind of pegged as being a base coat for doing contrast painting on, but I found it's actually a really nice kind of grey, covers very nicely, easy to dry brush. So again, just getting a little bit of moisture on the dry brushing palette, following the sort of advice from Byron. So it's not completely neat, it's slightly thinned down, and just a light dry brush. In this case, some of the flagstones I dry brushed slightly heavier than others, got a little bit of extra kind of brightness on there, so you've got some slight variation in the different flagstones without going nuts doing lots of different colours on them all. Just having a few of them being a bit brighter, as well as catching all the edges and that kind of stuff. So, you know, if you do a little bit too heavy, or you've got a little bit too much paint on the brush to start with, you can just wipe it off with your finger like I did there, or you can leave it and just have one flagstone that's a bit brighter. Maybe it's been replaced at some point in the dungeon's history, who knows. But I think adding a little bit of variation looks nice, and really this step just brings things out a bit more. And as I said earlier, you could just go black and dry brush up, but you can see here the difference between the light side and the dark side. It's nothing to do with Sith and Jedi, just I think it looks good. And again, it's subtle. You could do many more dry brushing stages, and the Artis Opus dry brushing, when he dry brushes tanks and things like that, lots of stages of different colours, and you can get really nice effects. Here I'm keeping it really simple because I'm trying to do these bases nice and quickly without mucking about too much, and even this you could cut down on a couple of stages if you wanted to, but I think this worked out pretty well, and it really doesn't take very long, but gives you a really nice effect for the models to stand on. So that's really it, and this is the finished base, and I think the effect is great. You've got some flagstones here which look a bit darker, you know, recesses and shadows and stuff like that, so the only thing left to do is to do the edge, and I favour black at the moment. I'm using AK black, which is a really intense shade of black. Put it on the wet palette, thin it very slightly so it flows nicely, a couple of thin coats, using a flat chisel brush, just around the edge of the base there, and I think that finishes the model off really nicely. Of course, some people do green edges to their bases, some people use Steel Legion drab, that's very common. I think that's what they favour in the painting studio at Games Workshop at the moment. Always changes over the years of what people like. I used to do grey, so they fit in better with the playmats that I was using, but now I think black is neutral. You can sit them on kind of anything and it works well. So yeah, simple, just go around, paint it nice and smoothly, and that's it really. I know this video has been perhaps slightly longer than it needs to be for something that's really quite simple and easy, but as I said, I had my mate Josh was asking about basing, so I thought I'd just really break it down. It's simple and quick. It really doesn't take a long time to do these at all, and I think the effect is great. I mean, the base doesn't want to detract from the miniature; it wants to elevate it and give it something to have a background and all that. But I think it's important to do something that's more than just having a black base or something like that. So I'm planning on doing a couple more videos like this, looking at some other basing techniques I've used on various other models. So stay tuned for those. Subscribe to the channel, and then you'll get notified when they go up, hopefully very soon. And it'd be good to see you again. There's links below for Element Games and where I got the STLs from for these Flagstone bases, so go check them out. And thanks for watching. Cheers. Bye.